Okay, well, I think we can go ahead and get started. So again, good morning. Thank you so much for joining us. If you don't know me, my name is Emily Gilbert, and I am the current past president of IACRL and chair of the awards committee. So we're so happy to have you with us today to hear from the winners of our recent People's Choice in Scholarly Publishing contest. So everyone, or award rather, everyone who's here has done great work, and we're really excited to hear from them. We also appreciate having you with us on this Monday after a time change, which, to be completely honest, the awards committee did not take into consideration when we scheduled this. So if any of you had chaotic mornings like I did, I appreciate you for being here. Just as a reminder, IACRL tries to do continuous events throughout the year for professional development and networking. The most immediate next event is going to be the Journal Club, which is happening this Friday. So I just put a link in the chat. The article is going to be discussed by two of the authors about moving to online programming. The authors that will be discussing it are Alyssa Drube of Northern Illinois University and Sarah McCone-Chase, our current Vice President, President-elect of IACRL, and she's at Aurora University. So we're very much excited to hear from them on Friday as well. So please feel free to join us then too if you can make it. Thanks so much to the awards committee for helping put this event together, and also to everyone who submitted their publications for the award. We're looking forward to going through another round of publications from Illinois academic library worker authors, so just keep an eye out for that. We will be accepting nominations in late winter, early spring, if memory serves. And thanks to everyone for being here today. And so we will get started. Here's how this is going to work. It's pretty simple. We're going to start with the presentations. Each presenter will have 15 minutes to speak. And at the end, we will do 10 or 15 minutes, however much time we have, of audience Q&A. So if you have any questions about any of the presentations, please jot those down, and you can ask them at the end. All right, thanks so much. And I will pass it over to Jungmi and Linda and Elena.
Great, thank you, Emily. I'm going to share the screen. Okay, so good morning, everyone. We are honored to be selected as the first place recipient of the 2022 ICRL People's Choice Award. My name is Jungmi Skulis. I'm the first author as well as the assessment coordinator of the university library. I'm here with my great co-authors, Elena Carrillo, the head of the Access Services, and Linda Naru, the associate dean. So this article is based on the project initiated by library administration, namely Linda Naru, at the beginning of the pandemic. And I will hand this over to Linda, who can provide background on our project as described in the article.
All right. Let me tell you first a little bit about the UIC community. We are a public research university. We have, at this point, a little more than 33,000, probably closer to 34,000 students enrolled in 16 colleges. We have a Chicago and near West Side Chicago campus, which has the Daily Library. That's the library that has the social sciences, humanities, and engineering materials. And the Library of the Health Sciences on our West Campus. Also in downtown Chicago, we have a law school, and the law school library is located there. And we have regional health sciences libraries in Peoria and Rockford. And just a note on this presentation is that we're focusing only on the Daily Library and the LHS Chicago Library, which are the two libraries that 90% of the university student population uses. So let me just say that pre-COVID, the Daily Library and the LHS Chicago Library received about 2 million visitors every single year. We are mostly a commuter campus, so the library is very popular with students who just come to the campus and spend their whole day here. And they need a place to come in between classes, and just to study and do their schoolwork or their research. So we were a pretty hopping place prior to March 29th, 2020, when all of a sudden we transitioned from being the place to be on campus to the campus where nobody was. So we pivoted to remote services for circulation, reference, and trying to support students who were also transitioning to this remote environment. The whole, I don't know, the whole environment was just so disruptive with social unrest and the pandemic requirements and precautions. It's just a very unusual time in our history. So in addition to all this turbulence going on around us, we had to think about what were going to be our best practices for health and safety guidelines when we reopened. And I think at this point in time, in this late spring of 2020, we all thought that we were going to have a very brief period of both the pandemic and the health safety guidelines and the remote work. So we were just preparing for kind of a temporary situation. And we were worried about what the student concerns were in coming back to campus or not being able to come back to campus. And Chun-Mi will tell us about how we approached our questions, our answers to these questions.
Thank you, Linda. So the primary focus of this project was to determine how we could ensure that health safety guidelines were followed. And we also decided to gather feedback from students from focus group. A series of focus group was conducted with UIC students who use either Daily Library or LHS, Library of Health Sciences, and Chicago Library. We did not include other regional locations because their applications of the health safety guidelines are different. So we invited only students who used Daily Library and LHS, Chicago Library. So to accomplish this, library administration assembled a task force, including the assessment coordinator and the staff in leadership positions from patron-facing service department. Since the university library had very limited time to prepare for reopening, we plan to complete focus group interviews with the students and share the findings with the stakeholders within a month. And this slide shows the timeline from planning to dissemination. So from far left, within 2 days, Linda and I outlined the timeline, drafted the recruitment messages, and created a sign-up form to recruit students. And within a day, our library marketing director designed the recruitment graphics for social media. And during this stage, we also set the scheduling, also developing interview questions and note template who actually participate, for the people who participate for the focus groups. So focus group interviews were conducted between June 18th and 26th. On the last day of the focus group, we provide instructions on how to code from notes, and then every project member was assigned to review and develop the codes. So I disseminate the focus group findings to various stakeholders until July 13th. So in spite of the limited timeline, we wanted to conduct proper procedures of the focus groups guided by research methods. So this slide shows more information on how we conducted the focus group interviews. So before the focus group interviews, we send a confirmation email with the interview questions listed below. So any participants who attended the focus group, they received this question and allow them to think it over what to answer. And during the focus group interviews, we began with what's the purpose of this focus group, and also we make sure the students are aware of how we protect the students' confidentiality. And after focus group interviews, we recorded attendance as well as we provided $20 gift cards for their time commitment, and also we have the recorded notes as well from all focus group facilitators. So we recruited participants through online survey, a total of 56 participants in the 12 focus groups. So this slide shows the focus group participants, and as you see, more than half of the respondents were from liberal arts and sciences, followed by College of Engineering and the School of Public Health. Almost 90% of participants primarily use daily library, and 70% of the participants were undergraduate students, followed by graduate students. So this is the key findings from the focus group, and it is also indicated in the table 4 from the article. And as you see on the left side, students' concerns were organized by these 4 categories: spaces, personal protective equipment, and cleaning and staffing and communications. And I want to highlight the key findings related to the staffing and training for monitoring compliances. So many students expressed that they wanted the students who are not following the guidelines to be gently reminded of the safety guidelines with 2 to 3 verbal warnings by either trained students monitors or library staff over security guards. As Linda described earlier about social unrest and the overall atmosphere. That's why we asked a specific question, how you want us to approach when you do not follow the health safety guidelines. So students also expressed a strong preference for someone in authority to do the monitoring, with the library staff being the top choice, as well as but the security guard being a last resort. The student also suggested more monitoring should be trained, how to approach students to become and part of the solutions. So this is based upon students' feedback, this is what we took actions. And based upon this feedback related to the staff and training, we actually recruited from the library employees who can volunteer and cover to monitor in the library. So each floor we assigned wellness ambassador, and we also developed and deployed bias and procedure training to all ambassadors. And if they couldn't attend the training, we also recorded and shared the recorded videos with all library members, as well as the contracted security, because we want to make sure that we all follow the same guidelines. So now I'm going to hand this over to Elena, who can describe more about how we actually use these findings.
Hello. So there's a whole bunch of future applications for sort of the process we went through for kind of gathering student feedback. And we're looking forward to engaging students more in our services and decision-making going forward. Some of the immediate things that come to mind are in this list, things like extended hours and the food and drink policy are dependent on the ongoing COVID situation. But there are other things that we've always kind of wanted to put into play that we're really hoping for good feedback from students in terms of what they need, things like a prayer space or a meditation area, broader renovation ideas, replacing furnishings, thinking about the space in different ways, and implementing things that maybe we haven't even thought about. So as Chung-Mi said, we were sort of in a pressure cooker to conduct the surveys about reopening the library, but now we're sort of in a good position to think more strategically about how we can incorporate student feedback going forward. Currently, we are still doing ongoing assessment. We've got a biannual regular survey, and we've also got a periodic patron survey that we're conducting. And Chung-Mi, if you could, thank you. So you can kind of see the trajectory from where we started with the focus group interviews in the summer of 2020, and we're now all the way to fall of 2022. We're doing our 5th assessment. It's currently underway to once again sort of take the temperature and kind of assess the climate of what's happening specifically in the daily library right now. But again, we're looking forward to the opportunity, perhaps starting in the spring or fall of 2023, to be broadening that scope and looking at what other services that we can provide that we can definitely use student input for. And if you're interested, we actually published the key findings across a series of 3 articles in the Journal of Library Administration. And we invite you to take a look at those and see the process from beginning to end. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Chung-Mi, Linda, and Elena. Now I'm going to pass it over to our 2nd place winner, Amelia Brunskill.
Great, thank you so much. I'll go ahead and I'll share my screen. Everyone see that? Perfect. Okay, great. Thank you so much. All right, I'll go ahead and get started. So thank you so much. My name is Amelia Brunskill. I'm librarian at the University of Illinois, Chicago. And this presentation is about this paper that I wrote called Without That Detail, I'm Not Coming, the perspective of students with disabilities on accessibility information on academic library websites. So as general background, it's common for academic libraries to have a web page or sometimes multiple web pages devoted to describing the resources, services, and facilities of the library for users with disabilities. And for the sake of brevity, moving forward, I'm going to talk about these as just sort of accessibility web pages or the library's accessibility web pages. But that's what I'm talking about when I say that. So it's common to have them. However, they vary considerably in terms of what information people actually put on them. There don't seem to be any clear standards for what they should include, nor can I find any literature on the preferences of users with disabilities for what's included on these web pages. So the question arose for me, what are students hoping to find? So what are their expectations, priorities, and preferences when they try, if you're a student with disabilities, when they're trying to locate and use these accessibility web pages? So what I did is I worked with the Disability Resource Center and the Disability Cultural Center on campus to sort of talk through the process, what recruiting, what questions might be appropriate or not appropriate, different issues, considerations that I should think about. And then they were very generous, and when it got to a point, went to the IRB, and then once at the right point, very helpful in terms of disseminating information about these interview opportunity to students through their networks. We did have a little incentive, gift card for the campus bookstores, and then we sort of proceeded. So I ended up having 12 students, a mix of undergraduates and graduate students who participated. In terms of the intake, I just asked, are you a UIC student and do you self-identify as having a disability? And there's some sort of broad categories that they could pick in terms of what disability they had. But then it was actually interesting, like during the interviews, many of them sort of spoke in more sort of detail about their disabilities. And they mentioned things like dyslexia, ADHD, brain injury, autism, mobility issues, chronic pain, nerve damage, vision impairment, depression, anxiety, and chemical sensitivity. And for a lot of them, they mentioned more than one of these for themselves. So in terms of the methods, it was semi-structured interviews that consisted of a number of open and closed questions. There are also 2 sort of little exercises that I made that I asked them to do. One was in terms of ranking options, in terms of where within a larger website of the library they'd expect the accessibility webpage might live. So if they're browsing, which drop-down menus or things might they look for that information under. And then from a list of 21 options, selecting their top 5 priorities in terms of what content to include on a webpage of information about accessibility. These interviews were conducted in spring 2019, offered to do it online through Zoom, which felt very novel at that time, or in person. And actually everyone chose to do it in person at that time, though occasionally I offered sort of like, oh, if there's a other location other than the library that would be better, I'd be happy to meet you there instead. In a couple of cases, we did that. So in terms of the results, so at the beginning of the interview, I asked them, whether they had previously used an academic library's accessibility webpage, and if not, whether they'd anticipate that such a page would exist. So of the 12 participants, 5 of them said yes, they'd previously used the library's accessibility webpage, which may or may not have necessarily been UICs, especially as there's a number of graduate students, so they might have used it at a previous institution. Of the remaining 7 participants, 1 said yes, they would expect the page to exist, while the other ones had sort of much more sort of mixed responses, including saying like, I hope that it would, but I'm not sure if it actually, I'd expect that it would. In terms of navigation and language preferences, in terms of what language they might use to find the page and how they'd approach that, 3 students mentioned they'd first search for such a page via Google. So they're like, oh, okay, if I was looking for UICs, I'd do like UIC library and then some language about accessibility or disability or their chosen language. 4 participants mentioned they checked the bottoms of the library website. They're saying like, that's where I often expect to find sort of a link relating to accessibility, is that's where a lot of people put it. They mentioned a variety of words and phrases that they might look to search for it, either on the library website or using Google. Accessibility and disability were each used by 6 students. But interestingly, it came up that at least for some students, those had different perspective, different interpretations. So more than once, people said like, oh, accessibility, they think of in terms of like mobility accommodations, such as presence of ramps, availability of elevators, that kind of thing, that they didn't necessarily, there was a sort of subtle sort of distinction that they had for those terms for themselves. Overall tone and feel of the webpage wasn't something that I specifically asked about, but it came up throughout the interview for a lot of the participants. So an emphasis on welcoming and inclusive language was mentioned by several participants. So sort of mentioned like, don't just say like, oh, we're doing this because ADA requires us to, like, we want you to feel like you are expecting us and you want to support us. One recommended that the language be vetted by multiple students with disabilities, saying, it's easy for people to include language that they didn't mean to be disrespectful, but actually really might hit someone wrong. Another recommended specifically addressing gaps and shortcomings. So, don't just wait for people to hit the brick wall. If you know that, there's an issue, be clear about it. Don't just wait for people to find it out on their own. In terms of the organization for the page and sort of how it should be structured, I had a series of questions about that. Multiple students mentioned the following things as being important, starting the page with some welcoming introductory language, so like, setting the tone really from the start. There wasn't a strong preference in terms of having everything on one page versus having different pages, but if you're going to have everything on one page, really the importance of having headings so it's clear to break up the content, so it's clear what's going to be on there and it's less overwhelming than a huge just wall of undifferentiated text. Contact information at the beginning of the page for someone who's familiar with disability resources and services. Sort of one person sort of mentioned the importance of not like then being ping-ponged around while they sort of say like, oh, I don't know, I'll try this other person. So really trying to get as best as possible to someone who might be likely to have the answer. Just generally though, participants were often unsure, had mixed feelings about how content should be categorized on an accessibility page. There wasn't sort of like, oh, this is a clear, obvious approach. There can be, a lot of content and it's not necessarily clear like how best to organize it. So on related notes, so in terms of potentially, lots of information, I came up with this list of sort of 21 different types of information, that could be included on a web page. And I asked, if you're new to a library and you're trying to learn about it, which of the below would be the 5 highest priority items for you to locate information on? And they didn't have to rank them within the 5, just saying like, okay, big picture, which would be your top 5. So I have a long list of things here. The three types of information that were most often chosen as the top five priority items for the webpage to include were sensory items, so information about noise, privacy, lighting, and the physical space, information about library materials with accessibility features, and physical building accessibility, so ramps, restrooms, elevators, things of that nature. But 18 of the listed types of information were chosen by at least one student. And this again, was a group of 12 students. And, a lot of the information was potentially of interest to different people. So I like to do a sort of selection of quotes from the interviews, because I feel like that's where, some of the richness comes in terms of the student experience. And this first one is actually where the title of my paper comes from. And student said, I would definitely want to know what the physical space is going to be like and what I'm going to encounter when I get there. This is something that people often push back on a lot. They say, that's a lot of detail you're asking for. And I'm like, without that detail, I'm not coming. I'll just choose to stay at home instead of coming to the library, when in reality, I would be a lot more productive at the library. This is another quote. I wasn't diagnosed until I was transitioning into graduate school, so I'm very new to services that are provided. So I probably would not have expected the accessibility webpage. I probably would have expected that, the accessibility webpage would exist, but I would never searched out for it. Another one is maybe because my disability is more invisible, so it's not really something I'd be like, oh, is this accessible to you? Another one is, I mean inclusivity, not forgetting about people with other types of disabilities beside physical disabilities or hearing or sight difficulties. And the last one I wanted to highlight is, I hope that the accessibility webpage would be easy to find and thorough, to make it seem like it wasn't just tacked on to the website as an afterthought. So based on all of that, I end up coming up with a list of recommendations, and I have 2 slides on this. And I think with all of this is, definitely don't let a perfection be the enemy of good situation. Some of these are, straightforward, easy. Some of them take, more time and work to do. And, you know, so these just, recommendations. It's not that you necessarily expect to get all of them on the first try. So, but first one is providing detailed information about the sensory aspects of the library, such as availability of quiet space, private spaces, lighting, and available furniture. And I'll just even say, like, I think this is really even helpful. This is helpful for librarians as well. Just when I get a question about these things, I personally don't have a very clear memory off the top of my head, like, what's necessarily where within the library. Including contact information, listing services and resources that could be useful to users with different types of disabilities, avoid building in assumptions about who might need information about what services, highlight content with accessibility features in the collection, include information on known weaknesses, include maps labeled with relevant facilities and sensory information, provide useful headings within the page, evaluate whether the language on the website is welcoming, determine if there's a group of students with disabilities on campus who might be available to vet the language and information on this page. Review the page regularly, particularly after a web redesign. That's something that actually one of those students specifically mentioned, that they're like, links are broken, I can't find things. It can be so frustrating when I have that experience. You think that you're in the right place and then suddenly the information isn't actually there. Ensuring appropriate search engine optimization so that it can be easily located. Having a clear direct link to the web page, to the page from the main library webpage. So it's basically the exercise, like, oh, where do you want to find it? They're like, please just give us a direct link. Like, I don't want to have to like play around and guessing where it would be. And especially if they're not even sure if it's going to be there to begin with. Then including links to this page from other relevant sites to include greater visibility. And just as a note, this was published in CNRL, and then I worked with some of my colleagues to do a second CNRL paper, which was looking at ARL websites and saying, okay, finding their accessibility web pages and looking at what information was included. And that ended up, that paper included a recommended checklist for a self-audit for accessibility web page, just as an option that people could be like, okay, well, what do we include? Where are things that we maybe want to add? And many thanks to MLA Research, Medical Library Association Research Training Institute. I did this as part of my fellowship there. So many thanks for all of their support. Also, thanks for the support from the University of Illinois Chicago Library Research Fund, which paid for the gift cards for the campus bookstore that I gave out. And my email address is abrunsk2@uic.edu or abrunsk2@uic.edu. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Amelia. All right, and with that, we will pass it over to our third place winner, Gwen Gregory. No,
Well,
thank you.
Thanks everyone for being here today. My article is a little different. My publication is a book chapter that was entitled Retreating to Advance Together, Communicating Through Internal and External Retreats. It was not a research project. So it was actually a book chapter. It was published in this book, Telling the Technical Services Story, Communicating Value. And this book basically focuses on the value of communication in all aspects of technical services work. And my chapter focused on having departmental retreats and how they can be a communication tool. So in case you haven't heard enough about the UIC library yet, the background is that I was previously the head of the Resource Acquisition and Management Department, the Technical Services Department at the University of Illinois at Chicago Library. And thanks to my colleagues for giving a little background on UIC generally. Now I work at Northern Illinois University, as you can see by the little logo on the slide. In our Resource Acquisition and Management Department, also known as the RAM department, we had 5 librarians, 15 paraprofessionals, and 12 to 15 student employees. And we held a total of 5 retreats from 2014 through 2019. You may be asking, what is a retreat anyway? So let's talk about that a little. Really, it's a planned time when a group of people get together, and it's different than your usual work meetings. Usually it will take place during work time and have a defined group of participants like the members of a department or even like everyone who works at a library. It will include planned activities of various sorts, which could be meetings, focus group kind of things, also could be having a meal together or doing icebreakers or doing team building activities. Usually it will take place outside of the normal work area. It could be, you know, in another building on campus or even another part of the library building, or it could be far away, like in another state, if you're really lucky. The point of this is to get away from the daily demands of our work and to avoid outside interruptions so that we're not sitting in our usual area where people are coming in asking us questions and doing all the day-to-day work. So to give us a little freedom from those outside interruptions, as well as get us kind of mentally away from that day-to-day work. Usually retreats are longer than normal meetings. They might be 3 or 4 hours, they might be a whole day, or even multi-day events. You might be wondering, why would I want to have a retreat? So there are a number of benefits to having retreats. First of all, you can do team building. You can, in many ways, get the people on the team that is meeting, whether it's a department or a unit or a whole library, on the same page about things. You can develop shared vision and goals through some intensive work that you might not be able to focus on in your day-to-day work. You can also explore concerns and issues that people have. You can focus on longer-term issues, not just your everyday questions that come up about this or that little thing, but focus on like the long term. You can also work on making some difficult choices. We all often say, what can we stop doing? But how do we really sit down and figure out what we can stop doing or choose what we want to make the highest priority in the future? And this goes along with fostering change if we want to make changes or stop doing things, how do we do that? What do we need to do for that? The whole process of having a retreat can also help people involved practice their leadership skills, whether it's facilitating or doing the planning or just participating in the groups. It really offers a place for people to practice these things. I also looked at, to be a little more researchy, the well, I have a retreat question from the point of view of the 4 frames of academic leadership model, which is from the 2011 book, Reframing Academic Leadership. The 4 frames are structural, political, human resources, and symbolic. Here are some retreat outcomes that fit into each of those frames, if you're familiar with that model. The structural frame really works well for libraries and retreats because you are analyzing the process and workflows, and you really analyzing kind of the structure of how things work in the library. In the political frame, we can work on building relationships with each other and with what relationships we want to build and plan strategies for how to get things done. As far as the human resources frame, the interpersonal interactions that take place during a retreat really help us to develop trust in each other and trust in the leaders, trust in the other people who are participating, as well as developing confidence in the relationships. And the symbolic frame, in the retreat, we can create a shared vision and culture. This is a place where we develop social relationships with each other and learn how to tell our stories to each other and develop our story that we're going to tell to the people outside the retreat. Here's a short summary of the retreats that we held in the RAM department. You can see starting with August 2014. And this kind of gives you an idea of when they took place, how long they were, and what the basic topics were. I'm going to talk about that a little more. Planning is, of course, very important for a retreat, just like it is for other events. And you can put together a team to work on the different aspects of the planning. Here are some things that you want to think about. First of all, the date and time needs to work for all the people you want to participate as much as possible. Location can be key, making it a location that is enjoyable as much as possible, but while having some of those qualities of being away from the usual workplace. It is important to have a defined agenda that specifies what is going to happen, and I have an example of that to show you. There's many activities that can be on the agenda, and often it can be a balance of serious activities that might be discussions or presentations, even readings, and then other activities that might seem a little more light, like icebreakers or team building activities, or even games, as well as having a meal together. It can work well to have a theme for your retreat, and this can help bring things together as well as add a fun element. I believe that we had a theme for each of our retreats, and they included things like under construction and back to the future, as well as vacation time. And that can provide a real creative outlet for people that you might have that like to do things like that, like make decorations. It's important to have a facilitator because someone needs to keep people on task with the agenda, as well as certain activities might benefit from having someone kind of standing up in the front of the room and calling on people or directing the taking of notes and that sort of thing. And finally, it is very important to have administrative support, both for and costs for the event, as well as to be committed to carry out what happens at the event. So, you know, if the department has a retreat, but the department head doesn't then follow through and carry the results of the retreat forward, that's not going to build confidence in the team that anything is ever going to happen in future retreats or even in the leader or the department as a whole. So both the leaders in the department and outside of the department need to be supportive of what is happening in the retreat generally. So here's a sample agenda. So you can see this was for, I believe this was for the 2019 retreat that we had, but you can see how it's pretty specific about the timing and when things are going to happen, as well as what the activities are. It's not super specific about exactly what's happening in each one, but it does give people an idea of what's going to be happening. And it can be distributed in advance so people know what to expect. I wanted to share the highlights of some of the retreats that we had. I thought this might be interesting to people that are thinking about retreats. In 2014, this was the first time many of the participants had experienced a retreat. So it was a learning process, and some of the things were unfamiliar. The planning also was new to us, so they took a little extra effort. But it generally was successful, and some amazing things happened that I won't ever forget. Some of the things that happened at the 2014 retreat, like specifically I'm thinking of the line dancing, which was pretty amazing. In 2015, in March, one of the more memorable things was we watched the This Is Broken video with Seth Godin, which really led to a lot of thinking about, all right, what are we doing that we don't need to do? How can we change things? People had gotten in the groove of thinking about things, trying to think about things differently, and the idea that things could change. In October 2015, we moved on to really agreeing on some departmental goals and creating the teams that were needed, assigning people to work on those goals. In 2017, we had a new aspect of the retreat where we invited colleagues from other departments to participate. And this really helped people to create new connections and communicate with people outside the department in a new way, to really hear details of what do you need from us? What can we do for you? In 2019, we had recently reorganized the department. So one of the things we did at the retreat was talk about the restructuring and how it was working. Maybe we needed to restructure some of the restructuring, and also thinking of some new teams and projects that could come out of the restructuring. And I thought I would share with you, this is a photo from one of the fun activities that we had when we had the Back to the Future themed retreat. We had a costume contest. I believe this was around Halloween time too. So I didn't want to share pictures of anyone else, but here is a picture of me participating, and all the departmental managers participated in the costume contest. Unfortunately, I was not the winner, but I did have fun, and I got to take my shoes off at work. Finally, it is important to think about assessment when you're having a retreat. We always like to do assessment of everything, right? Being prepared to do assessment, if you have an online survey, that usually works well. And having it ready to go before the retreat takes place, so that then as soon as the retreat is over, you can say, okay, let's get your fresh responses to what happened in a retreat. It's great to get sort of free text comments as well as statistics. And this all can be used for both justifying the event as well as for future planning of further events you might like to have, whether they're retreats or other kind of events. Here's a short summary of the assessment, the feedback that we got from the retreats that we had. This basically gives the number of responses and the percent of the total participants that responded. And one of the things we asked was people to rate the different aspects of the retreat. And these are basically the things that people rated the highest and lowest from each one. So you can see in the first retreat, people thought the worst part was the location or the room that we were using. So we didn't go back there and use that room again. And some of the other things, you know, we use this for planning future events to see what worked and what didn't work. And so here are some of the comments that we got in the evaluations, which were helpful to hear about what was working and what wasn't working. And it, you know, like people are enjoying the retreat. They like what they liked about it. One of the things that came out of the comments was the idea to have people from other departments come to the retreats. And so that led directly to in the 2017 retreat, where we had people from other departments join us for, not for the entire time, but for part of the time. So in conclusion, I do think that retreats can be an effective tool for team building and increasing the effectiveness and efficiency of the department or library. Planning is certainly required, but not, it's not terrible. And I do think that you can really improve workplace satisfaction by nourishing relationships. And one way to do that is with a retreat. And it's just great to have fun together. And then retreats are one way to do that. So if you're interested in seeing the chapter, it is available in our institutional repository at NIU at this address, or I'm happy to have you contact me directly, or you can also buy the book. So thank you.
Thank you, Gwen. All right, well, we appreciate all of you so much for sharing about your research today. And well, in Gwen's case, not exactly a research study, but we know research went into it. So thank you so much for sharing all of your insights. So at this point, we have 11 minutes left, and I'd like to open it up to questions from our attendees. So I'm not sure, Tam, are they able to unmute themselves and ask questions?
Yes, they should be. Hold on just a minute. Let me double check it.
Okay, thank you. And there you go, Gwen. Okay.
Yes, everyone is not unmuted, so anyone can speak, please, if they'd like to.
Okay, yeah. So please feel free to speak up with your question.
There is a question in the chat also, or in the Q&A.
Oh, I didn't even look in the Q&A. Thank you. Okay, so I'll read out the question. Thank you, everyone, and congratulations. I have a question about UIC's research fund. Is that a university-wide thing, or do the libraries fund these locally? What advice could you offer anyone who would like to get a similar fund started?
I know I mentioned the library fund, and now I'm trying to remember the details of it. I think, we do have, I can't remember if we have like a certain amount. So I think it is specific to the library, and it's something that the library set up, and it's something that you can email and put in a request sort of stating, what you need. But I can't remember, I'm sorry, off the top of my head, all of the details in terms of like if there's a limit to how much you request or how it works on the back end, or if the business office just does magic.
I am currently on the committee that approves those requests, but I'm only been on there for like a couple months at this point. So I know that there is a set amount for the research fund. I don't know exactly where it comes from though.
Maybe Linda, you can provide more information. I think for the faculty, we are allocated individual funds, but what Emilia described about the research funds is separate from the faculty funds. It's allocated a certain amount, but Linda can provide more clarification.
Yeah, it is a separate allocation from an individual's professional development funding. It is the source is the university library's budget, and the amount is set by the university library dean. And I actually don't know what the amount is at the moment, but faculty members apply to use the fund. They can hire students to help them with research projects. They can, I think they can buy supplies or books or whatever they need for their research projects.
Thanks for providing that clarification, Linda. So I guess oh, no problem. Josh said he's unable to speak because he's on the reference desk, but thank you. I guess the answer to how to get a similar fund started is get the buy-in from your dean.
Right. I think that depending on the size of the library, they may not have allocated research funds, but like when you request to the library dean, I think dean has the authority to support that kind of research, even though it is not research for the project improvement, especially compensation is very important to recruit the audience. So yeah, I think find out who are the stakeholders and why your project is important are the most important, depending on the size of the university.
Thank you, Jenny.
Mhm.
For Amelia, I saw in the chat, Eric said for the second presentation, did the study turn up any student perspectives on the usefulness of websites on mobile devices?
That's an interesting question. And no, I don't believe that it did. And I can't remember if I specifically asked about that or not. I don't think that I did, but yeah, that's certainly an interesting one because it definitely, the website certainly can change and look very different on a mobile device.
Thank you. And again, if you have more questions, please feel free to unmute yourself, or you can put it in the chat and I'll read it out, whatever works for you. We still have about 6 minutes, so we'll hang out in case more questions come in.
If I may ask a question to other presenters, I have a question to Amelia. So through your research, you discovered so many valuable information. I'm wondering what are the changes were made after, were there any changes made after your research project?
Yeah, absolutely. We definitely, I was like, I created a, audit. So I like applied it to our own one. And yeah, and I think in some ways, I think some of the biggest surprises that maybe shouldn't have been surprises, but like the emphasis on sort of like knowing information about the physical space and having that documented. And I think I just sort of realized from myself, I think here, and I think actually a lot of institutions, there's assumption of like, oh, well, you just kind of go to the space and you kind of figure out how it works, and not like this, like, okay, if you're wanting to think ahead or to plan, and if you have, of course, the people's perspective varied. Some people definitely talked about like, I I have a limited amount of energy and I have to be really careful to be like know where I am going, because I can't just be like wandering around like all four floors of the library to figure out like where's a good place for me to study or where to get the thing that I need. Like I need to really have like a plan to like get where I need to go, and to know that there is a space like, okay, where's the quiet space, how do I get there? And I think it's just so being a lot more intentional about being like, okay, what does a space look like, where is everything, where's a bathroom that has accessible stall, where are the quiet areas, um you know even like where in the building is the elevator, how does that work? So I think um just being a lot more intentional about those things, and even things like lighting, like, and I'd even had just as an instructor, um a student contact me because they're going to have a session in the library, and they're like, based on actually they need to have natural light, like they can't deal with sort of artificial blinking light. That's a big issue for them. And I realized like, oh, it's in a completely contained room that has absolutely no natural light, and sort of trying to think of like, oh, what's a space that would work better. And even things like sort of like lockers, like like, oh, sort of documenting like where do we have those and how do those work. um and the pandemic was also a bit disruptive because everything, a lot of the physical things changed in the library as well. So, procedures, but yeah, there was sort of a lot that I sort of looked through and like, okay, do we cover these things on our website, or are these things that like, oh, like maybe I would know, or maybe I wouldn't know if you asked me, but it hadn't occurred to me to actually document them.
Thanks, Jungmi, for the great question.
And I'll say that there's also things like, like the mapping, which we, it is still a sort of work under progress, but it sort of definitely started some projects like that. Like, oh, how can we document accessibility features? How can we, what kind of information would we put on a map? So yeah, it was really interesting.
Thank you. I have one more question that came in through Q&A. So Josh asked, Gwen, did you have any virtual retreats between 2020 and 2022, like during pandemic times? And were there any positives or negatives for meeting virtually, if you had any?
So thanks for that question, Josh. I could say that in the very beginning of 2020, we were just talking about having another retreat, but then like the pandemic. And then also I left and came to work at NIU in the summer of 2020. So I do not think that they have had any retreats since then, but I'm really not totally sure what the follow-up has been. I know that it would probably be like you could do things in a virtual format, but I don't think that for most people it would have the same impact as having it in person. But I don't know exactly what they might have done in the resource acquisition and management department.
Thank you. All right, well, it is 11:59. So I think we're gonna go ahead and wrap this up. Thank you again to all of our presenters. We really appreciate you being here to share your work with our attendees. And thank you again to everyone for coming. Again, if you would like to join us on Friday for the Journal Club, please register. And we'll see you soon. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you.